participant. For a menu of available...
Yeah, okay.
Dr. Manley and Dr. Sturm, you may begin.
All right, thanks, Raquel.
All participants are now in listen-only mode.
I have everything muted, so we will give you a chance to talk and we'll have some discussion a little bit later. But as Raquel mentioned, I'm Jody Manley. I'm the clinical director here at Mount Hope Family Center, which is located in Rochester. And we are part of the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, and as a member of that network, a lot of the material that we'll be sharing with you is information that we've shared from the NCTSN, which is funded by SAMHSA, so we have to give them a little shout out in appreciation for their support. And then with me I have Dr. Robin Sturm.
Yep, my name is Robin, and I'm the project director of a program called Building Healthy Children here at Mount Hope Family Center, which is a program that offers support services to teen parents and their babies.
All right, so I did want to mention, since we're talking about what can be a difficult topic, talking about trauma, and given the frequency with which people experience traumatic events, it's very likely that people on the call may have their own histories of trauma, or there may be things that are difficult in what we're talking about. So I do encourage you to be mindful of your own reactions to the material and to be gentle with yourselves if there's something that's distressing or that, you know, brings up certain memories or associations for you. Please do what you need to do in terms of your own self-care as we're going through. It's always a little bit challenging doing a webinar because we don't get to see your faces and have more of a dialogue and an interaction. But hopefully we can kind of join together virtually as we move along. So when you think about trauma, I always ask in groups kind of what comes to mind. And this definition that's on the slide here is a definition that a group in Rochester came up with, part of a SAMHSA Access grant. And so the definition that that group developed was that trauma is a response to a perceived threat to survival or emotional well-being of an individual or a large group, such as a community or culture. And trauma leads to adverse brain, bodily, and psychological changes that damage self, relational and spiritual development, and impair living, learning, and working. So I'm not sure how that definition compares with what you think about when you think of trauma, and we're going to break some of these pieces down, like the perceptions and the role that one's perception of an event plays. Sometimes it's surprising for people to think about how an event could affect a large group or a whole community or a culture, but since we've had so many events lately, whether it's the Hurricane Katrina and the aftermath there, whether it's some of the natural disasters that have impacted whole countries, or whether it's something like institutional racism and the impact that it's had on U.S. culture, I think it's not hard to imagine how a large group of people could be impacted. And we're going to go into more detail about the impact of trauma as we move along. I wanted to show you a video clip that was developed through the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, and many of our colleagues from the NCTSN are in the video. Also, I had an opportunity to meet the first speaker from the video about a year ago, and depending on time, I can talk a little bit more about his experiences. But there is some difficult material in this video. It's about 5 minutes long, but I wanted to, hopefully our technology will cooperate so I can play you a short clip.
It's unmuted.
My mother and my brother were murdered in front of me. He put the gun to my head and had me beg for my life. I was 10. I just turned 10.
It's hard to come out and say that I was a victim and that I was abused, especially when you're little, because it's like a big secret that's always on your back and that you never know when it's going to come out.
The image of my brother falling on that concrete floor and people stepping and just kicking with shoes on his face, I couldn't get that image out of my head.
Trauma is an overwhelming event. It takes away our safety, it creates a sense of helplessness, and it continues to affect our perception of our reality.
Some of the telltale signs of trauma are quite evident. Many of these symptoms, it's not that we don't see them, it's that we don't put together the entire sort of picture of what trauma is. Inability to sleep or interrupted sleep, inability to focus on what's going on, really not able to attend to learning. Adults need to be aware of children who are exposed to violence and intervene early and stop it.
I don't like the environment that I stay in. People getting killed every day, drug deals, people getting snatched, raped, cut up.
Whether it is a child who witnesses violence or a child who is the victim, you can't be fearful and be able to live your normal life. You have to be able to think clearly, and when you're traumatized, you can't do that.
Violence continues then to affect the child in their perception of the community, of their family. The danger is right around the corner. And the brain gets wired to expect danger.
My dad started actually physically beating me to the point to where I'd go to school covered in bruises. I don't know how many times I've been threatened to be killed by my own dad.
My brother got shot in the head. He didn't make it.
It makes you afraid at times. It makes you feel that, oh my God, you know what, I just lost a friend, I just lost a family member. It just makes you feel that, hey, I could die next, I could be the next one dead.
What trauma does is it triggers what's called the amygdala in the brain, which is our fight, flight, freeze center.
And it truly is a change in the brain and a change in the stress hormones that are flowing through the body.
All our brains have what we call alarms. Because the brain now has been wired for danger and it's triggered into this fight-flight, we don't just get over a traumatic event. It continues to impact us.
I started hearing my mom scream in the middle of the night. And it got to the point where he started beating me and my sisters. I let my anger build up, didn't talk to anybody about it.
When you hold everything aside, it's like a bomb and it's like ready to explode and just somebody push that last button.
Most kids who've experienced violence oftentimes have experienced multiple types of violence. In the kids we see, the average number of different types of violent trauma is 4. And so complex trauma then affects multiple areas of the brain because it's ongoing.
Maybe it's gang warfare, maybe it's drug use and abuse in the family, maybe it's domestic violence, maybe it's bullying at school. And if there is a layering effect of cumulative violence that changes literally the DNA.
It all started off with a hugging game. He would take us into his room. We would sit on his lap and he would hug us, and we weren't supposed to tell anyone.
When I was 5, I would have to leave kindergarten class and go home and have sex with this man who was in his 50s. I remember the long walk home and crying and falling down and having to get back up and walking on.
Child sexual abuse exists in the neighborhood, exists unfortunately at our schools, at our churches, at our homes, everywhere. And there are children out there suffering.
Our first assault was in high school. I met a guy at the church, and he wanted to be my friend. I thought it'd be great, and instead he assaulted me. and they'll feel very scared.
When you have a child that doesn't get to work through that abuse in an appropriate manner, that abuse doesn't go away. It lives in that child. Exposure to violence in childhood has been found to be associated with a really unbelievable range of long-term impacts.
Very young children who are exposed to violence many times have difficulty in establishing a trusting relationship. These children have fears.
You're twice as likely to develop depression. You're probably 3 times as likely to develop some type of anxiety disorder.
As they move into school age, they may have very, very serious behavior problems. As we look at adolescence, we see children running away. Sometimes children may be involved in the juvenile justice system, which puts the child at risk for being an adult offender. And so the cost of violence is staggering.
I felt isolated. Nobody knew what I was going through. To go 3 years without talking about it, I imploded.
Finally, after stressing and keeping everything bottled up and everything building up, I just finally broke down one day and attempted suicide.
Suicide is the 3rd leading cause of death of children and adolescents in this country. We always ask in every case, what role might child abuse have played?
My mother, she knew that stuff was going on, but it just seemed like she didn't really care. She never stopped that abuse. And to this day, I've never forgotten what some of my family members have done to me.
These are traumatized kids. And so how do we then, as adults, professionals, caregivers, put a system around children that really is trauma-informed?
Happy feeling. Good job. Okay?
What do we do differently to help rewire their brain? And then ultimately, how do we build capacity in order to really help our kids?
Everybody come together, whether it's in the community, in the home, in the school, wherever children are, and child by child, think of ways in which we can intervene early and educate people about what children need in order to grow, to thrive, and to continue to be resilient human beings.
All participants are now in interactive talk mode.
I'm unmuting. So we're hoping that we can a couple of minutes to get people's reactions. Out.
Yeah. Is that Leo?
Anyone have any? It sounds like we're getting more background noise than people's reactions. Anyone have a comment?
Hi, this is Michelle Gordon from Lower Hudson Valley Perinatal Network. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. One of the things that was brought up in the video that I just always try to keep in mind, just even as we're just encountering clients each day, is when the young man said that trauma that goes untreated in children doesn't just disappear. And oftentimes we meet adults who may seem, like resistant to change, or like they are, may even have certain attitudes or behaviors that can be difficult to deal with. We're forgetting that there is that underlying trauma that could actually result from something that happened in childhood.
Because she said her name was Michelle and I recognized her voice.
So some of what we wanted to think about is the impact of lifelong experience
All participants are now in listen-only mode.
I'm putting our phone back on mute because it sounded like somebody's hold music was starting up again. So we're going to move on. And so a couple of things that we wanted to emphasize was that for a traumatic event, there are several different parts of it. One is the event itself and what happened that threatened the well-being of the person, which could be something that they witnessed or something that they experienced directly. And then the other part of it is their perception or the experience of what happened, which people have a lot of range of reactions to events. But if someone has the perception that they were, their life was in danger or that they were seriously threatened, they may respond with that intense fear or helplessness or horror. And then those experiences and perceptions are going to have an effect that can really shake our belief about safety, about who we can trust and not trust, and so it can have ripple effects. So I'm not sure how familiar people are with the adverse childhood experiences studies. But the ACEs, or the Adverse Childhood Experiences, or ACEs, there was a study done by the Kaiser Permanente Insurance Company out in California, and they had about 13,000 adults that were part of the study. But because it was out of health insurance kind of population, it was a pretty middle class, pretty well-educated group. About half of them were over 60, about 3/4 of the group were white. So it was a pretty well-educated, affluent population, not necessarily reflective of the U.S. population. But what they did was, in addition to having all of their health data, they did a survey and they asked people about 10 items, which included physical abuse, emotional abuse and neglect, sexual abuse, physical neglect, having a substance abuser in the household, or having someone who was incarcerated or had a chronic mental illness, whether there was violence in the home or a parent separation or divorce. And when they got the results back, Robert Anda, who was one of the authors of the study, came and spoke in Rochester a few years ago, and he said when he got the data in, his reaction, he cried. And the reason that he cried was he was really stunned by the high frequency of people who reported these adverse childhood experiences. About half of the population reported at least one ACE, and about 1/4 of them reported at least 2. And what they found was that there was a very strong association between these early experiences and a cascade of events that impacted their mental and physical health, and actually resulted in earlier mortality by 20 years. So it's pretty striking to see that these adverse childhood experiences can have quite a dramatic impact. But we also know that with services and support and knowing that there is resilient functioning that happens, we can alter that trajectory. So just to think about those associations, those people who had more ACEs had increased rates of teen pregnancy and depression and alcoholism and suicide attempts and drug use, as well as some physical health problems like increases in liver disease and lung functioning, cardiac problems. And so you can see that especially for those people that had 4 or more of these adverse childhood experiences, the risks were vastly increased. And so people really started paying attention to what this is a dose-response relationship, that the more ACEs you had, the more serious the health consequences were, and people have started responding to this information with much more awareness of the impact of early trauma. So it's brought increased awareness to both the prevalence and the impact of these events and the ways in which these early experiences can affect health, mental health as well as physical health. And there's been some research in schools looking at how children who have these early experiences of trauma are more likely to have school failures, lower test scores, more language difficulties, and to be suspended and expelled more often and have more need for special education. So there are multiple systems that are now recognizing the impact of these adverse childhood experiences. But also knowing an ACE score doesn't tell you everything there is about the person either. And there are a lot of other events, including exposure to community violence, for example, that are not even measured with an ACE score. So one way we can look at trauma is to look at how the traumatic stress response is really a reaction to these experiences of threat that overwhelm our ability to cope. So if you look at the image here of, like, here are these trees in a hurricane, and the trees down in Florida, the palm trees can kind of sway in the breeze. Other trees may be more brittle and may snap more easily. But even the palm trees can bend to a certain extent, and then there may be winds that are strong enough that still uproot the tree. So, you know, similarly, people differ in their reactions to trauma, and they may be able to take a certain amount of stress, but then if it becomes overwhelming, that may be the point at which we see some more significant impact. So when we think about stress, we can also think about there are positive stresses in our lives that actually help us grow and change. Then there are those stresses that are more tolerable as long as we have enough support and resources in place. But there are also some stresses that are viewed as toxic because the stress overwhelms the coping, and if there aren't enough supports available, then folks can really have a negative impact as a result of the role, even physiologically, that these stresses can have on our physical health. And so I'm going to play another very short clip about the impact of toxic stress, especially in terms of children's development, but that can have long-lasting consequences into adulthood as well. So we'll see if our technology is going to go with us on this one too. Well, let me try it a different way. We'll see if it works better this way.
Learning to deal with stress is an important part of healthy development. When experiencing stress, the stress response system is activated. The body and brain go on alert. There's an adrenaline rush, increased heart rate, and an increase in stress hormone levels. When the stress is relieved after a short time, or a young child receives support from caring adults, the stress response winds down and the body quickly returns to normal. In severe situations, such as ongoing abuse and neglect, where there is no caring adult to act as a buffer against the stress response stays activated. Even when there is no apparent physical harm, the extended absence of response from adults can activate the stress response system. Constant activation of the stress response overloads developing systems. with serious, lifelong consequences for the child. This is known as toxic stress. Over time, this results in a stress response system set permanently on high alert. In the areas of the brain dedicated to learning and reasoning, the neural connections that comprise brain architecture are weaker and fewer in number. Science shows that the prolonged activation of stress hormones in early childhood can actually reduce neural connections in these important areas of the brain at just the time when they should be growing new ones. Toxic stress can be avoided if we ensure that the environments in which children grow and develop are nurturing, stable, and engaging.
Okay, so that just gives you a little sense of some of the impact. If we think about physiologically, when a traumatic event happens, that can activate the body's alarm system because we want to respond to whatever the threat is. And then it can result in traumatic stress or toxic stress, particularly if those alarm systems are always on high alert, and sometimes it's difficult to switch them back off again or to get back to a calmer state, which is understandable given that our bodies are really equipped to respond in order to protect us. So if you think about, like, you know, in some cases there's that fight-flight kind of reactions that help us either to deal with a threat or to run away to escape the threat, or in some cases people freeze and have difficulty even knowing how to respond. And as we think about the individuals that we're working with, we can think about the ways in which they may be in survival mode, where from that flight standpoint, they're really struggling to hold on to some feeling of power or control over their lives, and especially if they're feeling threatened, you may get that kind of more kind of fighting back sort of response. But other individuals may check out, or they may avoid situations that are stressful for them, or kind of disengage as a way of trying to manage that or cope with it. And then other people do more of that sort of freezing and just give up, or find themselves unable to speak up and to advocate for themselves. But that can get misperceived as well. So sometimes those individuals who are aroused and sort of fighting back or asserting themselves may be viewed as non-compliant or combative. Those folks who use the withdrawal strategy to cope may be viewed as uncooperative or resistant. And those who have more of a freezing response may be viewed as passive or unmotivated. So it's important for us to be able to view situations through a trauma lens so that we're able to join with that individual and understand their perception. And our interpretation then is going to be able to guide our intervention. Another thing that may be a helpful way of looking at this is to think about the invisible suitcase that the individual may be carrying with them of all of the messages that they've picked up along the way, or that they're perceiving their relationships with other people. So very often people may have that kind of inner baggage of feeling that they're bad, or that they're stupid, or that things are their fault, or that other people are going to hurt them. So if you take a minute to think about some of the individuals that you're working with and what those underlying messages may be that they may be carrying with them into their relationship with you, that may color the way that they're reacting to you based on their experiences in past relationships. So I'm going to share with you 12 core concepts for understanding traumatic stress. And these were developed by the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. So in some ways they're geared towards children and towards development, but I think that they certainly apply in adults as well who have a history of trauma. So the first one being that traumatic experiences are inherently complex. And when we think about complex trauma, one way of thinking about that is that very often people who have been through traumatic experiences have multiple forms of trauma. So they may have witnessed violence, they may have themselves been abused or neglected as children, they may have seen community violence, they may be struggling with the impact of poverty. So you have those types of complexities, but you also have the complexities of each traumatic event has its moment-by-moment challenges. So that first speaker in the video, for example, when he described how his family members were killed and how a gun was held to his head as well when he was 10 years old, every moment of that that experience of should he have tried to get the hold of the phone to call 911, could he have escaped, should he have stepped in between to try and help save his family members, all of those thoughts ran through his head and continued to have an impact on him later and impacted his response to that event as well, with some feelings of guilt, some feelings of, self-doubt. So thinking about those layers of complexity. Also remembering that traumatic events occur within a broad context. So each individual's personal characteristics, their histories and experiences, as well as their current circumstances are going to impact the response to that event. And they're very often secondary adversities or life changes or distressing reminders that happen. So, for example, when a child is removed from their home and placed in foster care, they may lose contact with other family members, they may have to change schools, they have new rules in their new home they have to learn, and for the families, the parents whose children are placed, they have to adjust to visitations and the demands for what they need to do to reunify with their child, etc. But there are a wide range of reactions for children and adults that happen when faced with losses or faced with traumatic experiences. So what can be traumatic for one person may not be as traumatic to someone else, and people cope in different ways. But one of the common features in response to trauma is that danger and safety become core concerns. And a lot of times when people have experienced something that is horrifying in their life, they are on alert for what the next threat might be. And they may be preoccupied with what happened, how to keep themselves safe, or they may have some distortions in what they view as safe and what's not safe, and sometimes people become more kind of risk-taking, and they may take their safety for granted or assume that things are safe that other people might view as dangerous. It's also important to keep in mind how traumatic experiences affect the whole family and the broader caregiving systems. It's usually not just one individual, but all of the sons and daughters and partners and children and all of the larger extended family may be affected as well. As we're thinking about risk factors and things that may result in more stress, it's important to also remember the protective factors and the things that can promote more resilient outcomes, which we'll talk about in a little while. We know that not only traumatic events, but also post-trauma adversities can impact development. And one of the ways it impacts development is actually changing brain development. and affecting developmental neurobiology because brains and bodies are affected by experiences. So people's stress hormones and their regulatory systems may also be impacted. We will spend some time in a little bit talking a little more about culture, but we want to be very sensitive to how culture is interwoven with traumatic experiences, in how they're perceived, in the responses to trauma, and in recovery, including differences in help seeking and differences in what is comforting and healing for different individuals based on their cultural backgrounds. There can be challenges to the social contract. So people may have felt that the legal system should have protected them, that various systems should have intervened differently. So just as relationships may be impacted and people find that they have trouble trusting other people, they may also have difficulty trusting the systems that are supposed to be helpful, including our helping systems and our service systems. And we'll spend some time at the end, but last but not least is recognizing the impact that working with trauma-exposed individuals can have on us as service providers and how there can be some secondary stress as well. So I've been talking a lot in hypotheticals. I want to put out there a case example and have us think about a young family with a mother who we'll call Brianna. And she was a 19-year-old single mom of a 10-month-old baby girl when she came into our program. And some things that I'll share with you about Brianna is that she had lost her mother because of bone cancer a few weeks before she had her baby. And this was extremely difficult for her. A little bit more about her background. Her parents were not married. They separated when she was a young child because of domestic violence, a very conflictual relationship. And when she was about 10 years old, she was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. And she needed to monitor the diabetes and had a lot of difficulty keeping up with her medical care around that diagnosis. So some other facts that I'll share with you about Brianna. She was the oldest sibling, so after her mom passed, she became the primary caregiver for her siblings, and even as her mom's health failed, she had a lot of responsibility in taking care of her mom. And she ended up dropping out of high school in 11th grade because of all of these responsibilities. And then a few weeks after her mom passed, her daughter was born very prematurely, weighing only 1 pound 15 ounces. Her boyfriend, who was the father of the baby, had a history of violent and controlling behavior, so he was not as much of a support as she had hoped when she became pregnant. And when she started working with us, she did not like the term depression. She didn't want to call herself depressed, but she did acknowledge that she was feeling down and feeling stressed out as much as 4 or 5 days a week. So she had called her pediatric clinic, and she had some transportation issues. She was running out of formula for the baby. She was at her wit's end and asked for help. So as we describe this case example, I think it's a little bit too challenging to open the phone lines because of background noise. But if you can reflect a little bit about, how you felt in hearing this story, and if we think about some of the different types of traumatic experiences that Brianna had gone through in her life, what kind of things come to mind?
Certainly there's the loss of her mother, her parents being separated when she was younger, the domestic violence that she experienced within the relationship with her child's father, and the premature birth of her baby. We didn't say before, but she ended up spending 75 days in the NICU, and that in itself is very stressful and overwhelming, I think. And the fact that she was a young teen mom is certainly going to add to that.
So there's certainly a lot of stresses and a lot of challenges that she was facing. If we were to go back to those ACE, those adverse childhood experiences, and think about her ACE score, really the only two items on the ACEs that she would qualify for would be the exposure to domestic violence in her home and her parents' separation. So her ACE score would only be a 2, which still puts her at some increased risk, but the ACE score doesn't really capture all of those other things that you mentioned, Robin.
Not at all. We're missing a lot of things like the loss of her mother. We're missing sort of the diabetes that the chronic diabetes and the challenges in being able to regulate that and monitor that and take care of herself in the way that she needed to. We're missing the controlling and violent behavior that she experienced within her own relationship. We're missing kind of the responsibility that a young teen had of a household and of siblings at such a young age. And again, we're missing the premature birth and all the feelings and emotions that go into dealing with that.
Yeah, so if you think about all of those things that were creating stress for her as a young mom, and then also thinking about the impact of that on her parenting and her ability to care for her daughter who had some additional needs and risks because of her prematurity, et cetera. So there certainly was a lot on her shoulders. If we think about the core concepts and think about what she had been through, how that impacted the whole family system, but all of the complexities and challenges with all of those different layers, and even what she might have perceived in terms of how various systems might have supported her, and then others that she may have felt failed her in some important ways. So it's important to recognize how trauma fits within a lot of different types of related risk factors. So very often, trauma, including violence exposure, can be linked with things like substance use, incarceration, homelessness, mental health problems, and those are in the broader context of things like poverty, health disparities, racism. So it's very often not just the traumatic experience per se, but also the context in which that occurs that can impact an individual or a family's functioning. So we want to think about what are the strategies that we can use, how can prevention and intervention address some of these issues, and especially to try and create systems and organizations that can be trauma-informed and that can be sensitive to individuals' experiences and to help create a context of healing and safety. So that includes a lot of different factors, physical as well as emotional safety, a more holistic approach to individuals' needs, and really connecting each person within their community context. There needs to be teamwork and shared responsibility, especially when you have these very complex and multiple issues that you're dealing with, and trying to anticipate and adapt to the changing needs with a shared understanding and trying to connect with people where they are.
Okay, so this is Robin, and I'm going to kind of take over at this point and just try and continue the conversation that we have here going on about thinking about how we can become trauma-informed, not only as individual service providers, but also as organizations and agencies. And obviously, we need to, first and foremost, acknowledge the prevalence of traumatic events and the toxic stress that are in the individual lives of our clients. Unfortunately, so many of our families experience trauma in their past. And if we look at the statistics, they say that about 3 out of 5 children or adolescents experienced at least one potentially traumatic event in the last year, including maltreatment. And about 4 out of 10 children are reporting witnessing some form of violence, with 8% reporting a lifetime prevalence of sexual assault and about 17% reporting having been physically assaulted. So this is the reality of our children and of our families, and these are the clients that are in our programs, and it's really important for us to be able to find ways to address this reality with them. So the idea really is to create a flexible framework, one that provides universal support, and yet one that is also sensitive to the unique needs of individuals. And this universal approach is really open to everyone. What is it that we can do for all in terms of families who have been exposed to difficult situations? But then we also need to be able to have different levels of support for those that are at more risk and those who might require more intensive support. Now, in offering this support, we need to be mindful of avoiding any re-traumatization that we might do for clients. And by looking through this trauma lens in the work that we do, that can help us in that area. We want to be able to build in sensitivity and recognition that, as Jody was saying, trauma can impact our clients' relationships with others in their lives. It can impact their relationships with us, and it can impact their perceptions of themselves. And there may be triggers in our clients' world that remind them of their trauma experiences, and we just want to be able to be aware of that. We want to be able to pay attention to that, and we want to be able to try to create our services and our approach to families with this in mind. So it's important to note that trauma-informed care is not a program. It's really rather a way of being. Think about it as an ongoing process that is unique to the strengths and the needs of each organization and community. And really the overall goal is to be able to have our systems reduce stress for families and to be able to provide a protective measure for them. Now, there are 5 different core principles of trauma-informed care that we can talk about. These include safety, trustworthiness, choice, collaboration, and empowerment. And from a trauma-informed care perspective, all of these principles really need to be integrated into all aspects of our programs and the way that we're delivering services in order to help our clients and survivors work towards and achieve their healing and their recovery. So let's just talk quickly, briefly about each one of them a little bit more. When we talk about safety, really what we're looking at is trying to help clients feel not only physically but also emotionally safe, not only with us as service providers, but also with the other staff in our agencies and with our agency itself. So we might want to be asking questions like, how safe is the first contact that we have with our clients? What does that intake process look like? And what kinds of questions are we asking? And how might our clients be feeling and perceiving those questions that we're bringing up? Are we creating a space that feels non-judgmental and supportive for them? And even in terms of that physical safety, what does our building look like to them and the room that we're meeting in? Is it inviting and does it feel safe? So really asking ourselves, how can we provide that sense of safety? It's really important to be thinking in those terms. Another core value is trustworthiness, and programs can try and maximize trustworthiness by first making sure that the expectations involved in our programs are very clear, by making sure that we're very consistent in the way that we're approaching our families and in practice throughout treatment, and by maintaining appropriate boundaries with them. So the bottom line really is, do we do what we say we're going to do? We need to be able to help families know that we're being true to our word. So again, thinking about the questions we want to be asking ourselves, is our program providing enough clear information about what will be done? What services are going to be provided? Who is going to be providing those services? when and why and at what cost are those services going to be provided?
An example of that, too, I was hearing about some of the security guards and staff at the family court, and before receiving some trauma training, they would promise the kids that, oh, well, when you go into court, it'll all work out okay, everything will be fine, you have nothing to worry about. But sometimes the outcome in court was actually that bad things did happen and that the decisions that were made were not necessarily what that youth would have wanted. And so they became more aware that making those promises when they didn't really know what was going to happen, they were trying to be reassuring, but it kind of backfired because they became just one more person that could be perceived as lying to the individual. So, you know, thinking through the implications of what we say while we want to make a promise that I'll ensure that nothing bad will ever happen to you again, that isn't necessarily helpful as much as we are trying to be reassuring.
And in regards to choice, asking, do clients have a choice over what services they receive, or who they receive them from, or when they receive them, or even where they might receive those services? Now, some programs might have more control over these kinds of things than others do, but what is it that you're able to give them in a sense of control over? In a trauma-informed system, we really want to be considering what ways we can modify our services and the way that we're delivering them so that choice and control really can be maximized. So asking, are they being informed about the options that are available for them, and are they being informed about the choices that they have? Even if it's something as simple as, you know, where can we meet? You know, we can meet either here at the center, or I can come out to your home. We can meet somewhere out in the community. What's going to be most convenient for you, and what is your preference? Or asking, you know, when and how often they would prefer to meet. Is it once a week? Is it, you know, biweekly? Is it monthly? If you have that freedom or that luxury to do that within your program, that's giving your clients a choice, and that can be a really core value of being trauma-informed. Now, what about collaboration? You know, do families have a significant role in planning of the services and planning of their treatment goals, and even in evaluating the agency's services? Is there some kind of consumer advisory board that they can sit on? But really what we're looking at is what are we doing to make sure that the client's voices are being heard and that their voice is at the table when these things are being decided and looked at. So asking ourselves, is there a model of doing, quote, with rather than doing to or for families? And are we giving this message that this is something that we're going to do together? You know, letting them know that we're each going to be bringing something important to the table. And I might know a lot about child development that I can share, but you as the parent are the expert on your child, and you know what's best for them, and that's what you're going to be able to bring to the table. And really what we're doing here is emphasizing that collaborative nature to the work. I'm not going in there as the expert and just telling them what needs to be changed. This is a process that together we're going to go on a little journey and figure that out together. And lastly, there's the core value of empowerment. So our clients' strengths and skills being recognized in our work with them. And after each contact, after each visit, you know, within each visit, our clients feeling validated and affirmed by us. You know, are we focusing on developing their skills or enhancing skills that are already in place? So really that the client is able to regain some sense of control or some sense of power that might have been lost through their experiences of trauma and abuse. So again, asking, are we focusing on that skill development? Are we focusing on those strengths, and are we recognizing the skills that our families have? Now, it's very important to be sensitive to the cultural issues that are happening in the work that we do with our families. And by that, what we mean is that every family has their own values and beliefs, which are influenced and they're developed by the way that they were raised and by the way that they were parented. So we really need to work hard at trying to understand the family's cultural context. And we need to know that the cultural considerations can impact how the individuals perceive their situations or their trauma. It can impact their responses to it and their approaches to recovering and healing, as Jody said previously. It can also impact the views of service providers and helping professionals, and in particular, how they might view us in working with them. So what we want to try to do is to promote healing through respecting those cultural support networks and just honoring each individual for who they are. And we can do this by focusing on learning rather than judging. And in that collaborative effort that we were just talking about, we can learn what each family is about and what their own unique experiences and perspectives are. So, what can we do as a caring adult and as a service provider working with a family who may have experienced some form of trauma? We can begin first by asking what happened to this person instead of saying what's wrong with them. And we can make a special effort to really try and integrate those culturally sensitive practices and responsive services into our work with the family. We do this by using the awareness that we're gaining and by understanding each family system, by being aware of their values and beliefs, and which may or may not be different from our own. And we can also ask whether or not our program is a good fit for the family. If it's not, how can we help them obtain the right services? We can also be aware and try and understand the cumulative effect of trauma on families. The more that we can learn about their experiences and the more that we can understand, then the better and the more comprehensive the support will be that we can offer them. And we want to try and recognize that a child or a client's, quote, bad behavior sometimes really is just the adaptation that they have to the trauma that they experienced. So instead, what we want to try and do is uncover the meaning behind the child or the client's behavior. So when we see that overly aggressive behavior by a child in school, that really may be just stemming from the way that they learn to protect their siblings or protect their parent during domestic violence incidents at home. So how do we begin to even uncover the meaning behind these behaviors? We have to remember it's a process. What we want to try and do is just build and develop that trust over time with our families, and we do this through our active listening, through our validating that we can do for our families, through encouraging them in the way that we are being as honest and clear about our services and the support that we can offer, and also by just having frequent and consistent contact with them. And as Jody just mentioned, we want to try and avoid making professional promises that if they're unfulfilled, they can likely lead to some more traumatization. So for a child who's in foster care, we don't want to say something like, I promise you that you're going to be able to go home to mom, or to that parent we don't want to say, I know your child's going to be able to be returned home. Because the reality is we just don't know what will happen. So while we can't make promises, we certainly can listen to their concerns. We can validate those concerns, and we can encourage them to continue to take the steps that are needed for that to happen and for that outcome to be the case. So what I want you to try to do now is just to think back to one or two of those clients that Jody had you think about earlier with their invisible suitcase. And we want you to try to consider how you, as a service provider, can help them repack their suitcase with more positive experiences and beliefs. Think about what would be needed to convert those negative messages to more positive ones. And think about how we can support families in developing more resilient outcomes. Resilience really is the ability to recover from traumatic events. So how can we promote that resilience by helping clients feel more safe, make them feel more lovable or more capable? And I want you to think about the messages that we send children over while they're growing up. When we protect children from harm, they learn that the world is safe. When we support and nurture and respond to them, they can learn that they're capable. And when we give them affection and love, children are learning that they're lovable. So with these messages, their suitcase then can be repacked with more positive beliefs and experiences like, I am lovable, I am safe, and I am capable. So you, as the service provider, are in a perfect position to be able to provide these same kind of messages to either the kids that you're working with or to your adult clients, again, through that validating process, through praising them, by staying strength-based in your work with them. Every time you're modeling safety and setting boundaries for them, you're working towards this. And I want you to think back again to those core values of trauma-informed care. That's you encouraging and empowering them, and that's going to help them repack that suitcase. Now, it is important to remember that not all clients who've experienced trauma are destined for negative outcomes, and this is where this whole idea of resilience comes in. So despite adversity, there are some individuals who can just utilize their support systems and their strengths, which build those protective factors that we discussed earlier, and this in turn reduces the risk of problems and challenges. But really, what is it? What are the factors that are out there that can increase resilience in families, and what can we do to try to enhance those within our clients? And know that these factors can apply to children and the adults that we work with. So one factor is having a strong relationship with at least one competent and caring adult. And another factor is feeling connected to a positive role model or a mentor who can help build that resiliency. Again, we're in kind of the prime situation to be able to provide that to our families and being that supportive person. We're also in a position when we're going and meeting with families on a regular basis to be able to help them identify other people who might be able to be providing that role for them within their own environment. Sometimes they may be having a hard time seeing who those supportive people are in their world, and so we can help identify and point that out for them. Another factor can be having talents and abilities that can be nurtured and appreciated. So how can we help clients thrive by supporting and helping them to nurture whatever talents they might have? For example, someone who loves to do hair, can we help them turn that into either a job or a career? Someone who might have an interest in writing poems or stories. Can we encourage them to do this not only as a means maybe to process their experiences through some journaling, but maybe we can even get them to share their work with others to get that sense of feeling appreciated or their work being appreciated. Something else that has been shown to increase resilience is feeling some control over one's life, and I think this is for all of us, right? But can we help clients build some of this control, or can we help them find ways to advocate for that control in their life? And then there's the final factor of having a sense of belonging to a community, a group, or a cause that's larger than oneself. So are there ways that we can link them to natural resources in the community, or can we connect them with groups or causes that can help them feel empowered? Now, the research in this area has highlighted several of these factors that are definitely associated with a client's development of resilient functioning, and it enhances their chances of being more resilient. So we've talked about the family support, peer support, and that sense of feeling connected to others. Having spiritual beliefs or having high self-esteem or perceptions of competence. These factors all really build a sense of I am lovable and promote that sense of I am capable, or I can manage, or I can find meaning in the experiences that I've had, which is really what we want in their invisible suitcases, right? So we as service providers can build some of these factors not only into our style and our approach with families, but also into the programs that we're providing. Here at Mount Hope, we have monthly group connection events for some of our teen moms in the Building Healthy Children program, where really it's, they're coming together for a couple of hours on an afternoon for some fun activities with them and their children. But it's really about them forming connections. It's really about them making relationships with some of the other moms in the program and feeling that sense of belonging to a particular group. Okay, so we know that doing this work can certainly take a toll on us, and some of us may even have our own history of trauma that we're trying to work through. So how we cope and how we manage can be really very important. There can be warning signs for burnout or what is called compassion fatigue that may lead to challenges for us in doing our work. Other terms that you might have heard for this can be secondary traumatic stress or vicarious trauma that really result not from you directly experiencing that trauma, but from working with clients and hearing their stories about their traumatic experiences. And the symptoms of secondary traumatic stress can really mirror the PTSD symptoms that our clients are experiencing. Now, we do want to distinguish, though, because we all have some days where we feel stressed, or if you're like me, maybe you binge on chocolate a little bit more than you should, or caffeine. But if you're recognizing that these warning signs are beginning to show up more often than not, then we really need to pay attention to that. We need to pay attention to what our body is telling us. So there are some questions that we can ask to monitor how we're feeling and how we're doing. So things like, are you feeling more mentally and physically exhausted most of the time? Or are you using alcohol, food, caffeine, or other substances to combat feelings of being overwhelmed? Are you sleeping a little too much or a little too little lately? Do you feel numb or distanced from others? Have you stopped taking satisfaction in your work? Are you dreading getting up and going to work each day? Or, geez, are you dreading that phone call that you know you're going to get from a particular client? Are you feeling moody, or do you fly off the handle more frequently? And are you having frequent headaches, stomach aches, or catching every cold that seems to come along?
So we can't see your faces right now and see how many people are nodding their heads, but I bet there are some people out there who are seeing some of these questions and going, yep, that happens sometimes.
So if we do recognize some of these vicarious traumatization or secondary trauma signs, then we really want to have a way to address them and cope with them. And this is where we really need to take care of our needs. On an individual level, we all cope in different ways, and what works for me might not necessarily work for you, but it really is important not to brush this off, but to think about these things ahead of time so that you have a plan, you know what you're going to do, what your self-care looks like when the time comes that you're going to need it. And self-care can take on lots of different forms. It can be strictly getting more rest. It could be listening to music or reading a favorite book. It could be taking breaks, turning off all electronics, or maybe turning your phone off for an hour. It could be getting some fresh air and taking a walk around the block. Your self-care could look like trying to eat more healthy and exercise more often, or simply just trying to find a way to smile and laugh each and every day.
So some of those things that like your doctor tells you to do and you say, yeah, and nod and smile and don't always do them. But it is important in the work that we're doing to, we have to put the oxygen mask on ourselves so that we can have the energy and the emotional availability to help the people that are coming to us for services. And we're also encouraging parents to do the same thing, to take care of their needs so that they can better care for their children.
And as we talk about that individual self-care, we also need to have self-care built into the existing structure of our agencies or organizations. And really what we're striving for is what we call compassion satisfaction. This is where we're looking out for each other and we're supporting each other in the work that we're trying to do. So asking, do you have opportunities to be able to talk about, express, or reflect on the work that you're doing with your families, or talk about your feelings that are coming up with particular families? Do you have an opportunity to do that either on a more formal basis or within, peer supervision times? Here at Mount Hope, we, every other month, try and schedule and plan for what we call our wellness events, because that's our way of making sure that we're taking care of our needs as a clinical staff. Now, we all know, though, that as things become more stressful for us, it can become more difficult for us to support each other. So meetings and get-togethers that we used to have start to drop off, or people start to get more short with each other. So if you see these signs happening with your colleagues with this idea of compassion satisfaction, you can be helping each other and supporting each other through this. So if I recognize in Jody that she's you know, looking a little off, she's having some times where she's maybe a little short, I can ask her, how are things going? What's going on with you? And we can have a conversation about that. And if you see within your organization some of these things, you might want to re-examine how wellness can be built into the structure of your agency.
And sometimes it's at those times when we're most busy that taking a chance to have a lunch break or something, some of the get-togethers and supportive activities fall by the wayside. But those are the times that we need them the most.
Absolutely. So in closing, what we want to do is just draw your attention to some useful websites that we use quite a bit. There's the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, the Child Welfare Information Gateway, and the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. And within each of these sites, there is a wealth of information with materials, webinars, toolkits that are all related to trauma and the impact that it can have on families, on children, and on development. And we just want to end here by emphasizing that, we can all, no matter what our role is, we can all be instrumental in fostering the resilience in clients and supporting our families even through difficult situations. And so that's kind of the end of our formal presentation, and I think we have a few minutes here that we can maybe try and unmute things here and open things back up to some questions.
Yeah, as I unmute the whole line, I would ask if you have a lot of background noise where you happen to be on the call, or if you aren't planning on speaking, if you can put your line on mute so that we're not all hearing that background noise, that'd be helpful. But I'm unmuting now.
All participants are now in interactive talk mode.
So we have time for questions, and I think that Rochester have been filling.
You know what I realized?
Good afternoon, everyone. Robin and Jody. Currently I do not have any questions or comments on the chat box.
Exactly, but we need
do we have any questions for those on the line, participants? Questions or comments you want to make to Jody and Robin?
Yeah. This is Cheryl Hunter-Grant, Lower Hudson Valley Perinatal Network. This is very informative. I'm hoping we'll get a copy of it, and because it seems like something we may need to review again and again, and then look at those specific places we can put things in place in our organization. Or is that something the COE is also going to be guiding us, giving us either a checklist or some bullet points that we should consider in MISH and how we'll deliver services from this trauma-informed lens, as well as elements we need to look at for our organization?
The slides will be shared with you, so you'll be able to get a chance to have that material. And
QB might know what's going on. What's going on?
Hi, this is Raquel. I hear a lot of background noise. Please, if you can, please mute your line. To address Cheryl's comment, yes, we will share the slides with you along when we send you the link to the webinar evaluation this afternoon. In terms of your other comments, Cheryl, at our next week's annual meeting, we will have a presenter to talk about trauma-informed care at a systems level and what that looks like in our own organizations. But I think that this needs further conversations. This is not just a topic that we can address in one webinar or in one meeting. I think that to look at your organizations and for you to review your own policies and protocols, that it will need someone to come in and provide further guidance.
I agree. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thanks for the question.
Hi, this is Amy Jositis from the State Health Department.
Hi.
And I have a question about the building resilience of factors for resilience. Is there anyone that's weighted more strongly than other ones?
It's an excellent question. Which factors are most important? I don't know of any studies that have kind of weighed them against each other because that information is kind of drawn from multiple sources, and it may depend on each individual. You know, for some people, joining Mothers Against Drunk Driving and having a cause and really going after that may be the most salient thing and the most important for them, whereas for other people it may be having those pieces and control of their lives, and for other people it's more having supportive relationships that they draw on. So I don't know that there's a one-size-fits or that, you know, we should focus on one of the areas, but hopefully to build as many of the factors in.
Thank you.
Hi, could I ask a question? You said that she's going, I don't know, the first. Hello?
Yes, I think I was hearing someone say they wanted to ask a question, but I can't hear the question.
I'm a nurse with the Early Interventions Program. We're working very closely with Children's Protective Services.
Yes.
The CPS services. And I was just wondering, in your area, how you find their training and foster care training, if this is filtered down to that level so that the providers of care for these children is, are they able to also be instrumental in applying some of your skill training?
It's an excellent question about, you know, how do the different systems, especially the child welfare system, because we know that who are involved with child protective and foster care almost by definition have gone through trauma. So certainly having a trauma-informed and sensitive response system is critical. You know, in our county, the Department of Human Services has really been active in trying to address some of those issues, but they also, I think, would be very willing to acknowledge that they still have a long way to go. And looking at the very traumatic stress for child protective workers, you know, that's a big issue as well, because that's a very difficult job.
Thank you.
Robin and Jody, I have a question via the chat box, two. The first one being, can they discuss more how socioeconomic factors influence trauma and a family's ability to cope?
Sure. Socioeconomic factors, certainly a lot of the families that we come in contact with, and Rochester unfortunately has very extreme levels of poverty. And if you look at some of the stresses and challenges for families in impoverished neighborhoods, we have some concentrations of neighborhoods at the highest rate of poverty, also have the highest rates of unemployment, highest rates of child protective involvement, and don't think it's coincidental. You have that concentration of risks. Families that are struggling with poverty certainly have stress, so just trying to make ends meet, trying to figure out whether to, you know, pay their rent or buy food. So that can cause a lot of challenges, and very often they may also be experiencing violence exposure and other kinds of traumatic experiences.
I'm unconscious. You can still stick everything and penetrate me. And
another question I had on the chat here was a comment and a question. There are some ACE studies that look specifically at maternal care. Will we be looking at those specifically, in particularly the one around prematurity?
Oklahoma?
And
people are there like
and maybe this other question is for the COE, and so we may possibly look at that at a future point. But
yeah, specifically looking at whether those adverse child on the slide earlier, I presented increased risk for pregnancy associated or and you know, there could be more that we look into that is presented, as Raquel said, in the future about a specific premature birth and rates of that. It's not too much of a stretch to say that stress can certainly have an impact on pregnant moms that can affect her physical and mental health.
Ella sale de Queens.
A lot of extraneous conversations.
La verdad, pero ¿será que quiere venir el señor o no?
I'm wondering if people could either ask a question or mute their lines.
Okay.
Jody, hello. There's another question. What can community health workers do when the community and the environment itself is traumatizing?
I'm sorry, Raquel, it's hard for me to hear you. Can you repeat the question?
Yes. What can community health workers do when the community and the environment itself is traumatizing?
Hay una convención que se llama de las Artes de Nueva York.
Okay, so I feel like I'm having to talk over other people, but...
So if you want, go ahead and mute the line and then answer the question.
All participants are now in listen-only mode.
Okay, so in the minute or two that we have left, yeah, certainly one of our challenges is there are a lot of things going on out there that we don't have control over. You know, it would be great if we could prevent adverse childhood experiences by eliminating violence and supporting all families to prevent child abuse and neglect. But there are a lot of factors, you know, with whether it's poverty, whether it's community conditions, the economic climate, et cetera, that we don't have control over, but trying to identify what are those areas that we may be able to help support a family, we may be able to connect them with resources. I don't know, Robin, what are your thoughts?
I think also just in terms of that sense of trying to maintain that strength-based approach and outlook. Obviously, if a community is going through something, everyone's experiencing it. And, you know, just trying to, for the most part, see where we can find ways to see that silver lining, if you will, and how can we focus on that, and how can we support and validate what we're all experiencing, what we're all going through, as a way to keep the momentum and keep the motivation going to try and continue to process and heal from whatever it is that the community is experiencing.
And just as a final note that maybe we can end on is never underestimate the power of a positive relationship. So those relationships may be the key. Robin and I were with our colleague this morning as she was at a funeral for her mother. We can't make that death go away, but we can be there for her and we can support her through that process, which, if I think about my own life experiences, you know, a lot of times I didn't necessarily want my friends to fix everything or to give me all the answers, especially in those big situations where there may not be an answer. But if they could be there with me, be present in the moment, and have my back when I needed somebody to have my back, that is tremendously important. So you can be that person for the client that you're working with, even if you can't solve all the problems. Being present in the moment, being there for them in hard times can have a tremendously positive impact.
All participants are now in interactive talk mode.
Hello? I think that's time to wrap up, and I didn't know if you had any final comments.
Yes, I would like to say that vicarious trauma, as case managers, we all face some kind of vicarious trauma. When learning about our clients, the adversities that they face. And so how do you think that we, I guess not to get disengaged, but how do we deal with that as community health workers, case managers, or family service workers?
Well, for us,
pero él no tiene que tener licencia. Ellos ya
at this point, I want to thank you all for participating.
Usted no le va a poner ¿cómo se llama? No le van a pagar con cheque, tal vez no se le van a tener. Es para una ¿cómo se llama? Sin fines de lucro. Y es para algo sin fines de lucro, solamente